There is a staircase inside Graceland that no tourist has ever climbed. No camera crew has ever filmed it. No journalist has ever been invited to walk up its steps and peer down its hallway. For nearly half a century, that staircase has stood as one of the most quietly guarded boundaries in American cultural history, a simple division between what the world is allowed to see and what the Presley family has chosen to keep entirely to itself. Below the staircase, millions of people have wandered to the famous rooms, the mirrored living spaces, the trophy room lined wall to wall with gold records, the legendary jungle room with its waterfall and green shag carpet, and the meditation garden, where Elvis himself now rests beneath a granite stone. But above the staircase, behind a locked door at the top of the landing, time stopped on August 16, 1977, and has not moved since. That is the upstairs of Graceland. And for the first time in decades, the woman who now owns it, Riley Keough, Elvis Presley's granddaughter, daughter of the late Lisa Marie Presley, has begun to speak about what lies beyond that door. What she has shared is not sensational in the way tabloid headlines might suggest. It is something more profound than that. It is personal. It is quiet. And it tells a story about a man the entire world thought they knew, but who kept the most honest version of himself locked away from nearly everyone, including, in many ways, his own family. To understand why the upstairs of Graceland matters so deeply, you have to understand what the house itself represents. Elvis Aaron Presley purchased Graceland in March of 1957 when he was just 22 years old and already the most electrifying young performer in the country. He paid roughly $100,000 for property, a colonial-style mansion set on just over 13 acres in the Whitehaven neighborhood south of Memphis, Tennessee. At the time of purchase, it was a relatively modest home, built in 1939 and named after the original owner's niece. But Elvis didn't want a showpiece. He wanted a sanctuary. He wanted somewhere he could retreat to when the noise of fame became unbearable, and it became unbearable very quickly. What he created over the next 20 years was something entirely different. Graceland became a living, breathing expression of who Elvis was. Extravagant and sensitive, theatrical and deeply private, surrounded by people yet profoundly alone. He decorated it in bold colors and unusual textures. He installed a television room with 3 screens mounted side by side, so he could watch multiple channels simultaneously. He built a racquetball court on the property, added a swimming pool, and transformed an ordinary den into the jungle room, a space so outlandishly decorated that it seemed more suited to a fictional movie set than a real southern estate. Yet in that same jungle room, he recorded some of the most emotionally raw music of his career. The contradictions were everywhere in that house. Graceland was never just a home. It was a mirror. When Elvis died on August 16, 1977, he was found on his bathroom floor on the second level of the house. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, with prescription drug dependency listed as a contributing factor. Within hours, the upstairs was sealed. His father, Vernon Presley, made the decision personally. Nothing would be moved. Nothing would be cleaned out. Nothing would be altered. The second floor would remain exactly as it was on the last morning of Elvis Presley's life. That decision has held for nearly 50 years. Riley Keough was born in May of 1989, the daughter of Lisa Marie Presley and musician Danny Keough. She grew up aware of her grandfather's legacy in a way that very few people on earth could truly understand. Not as a fan, not as an admirer, but as someone who carried his blood in his name and the weight of everything those things implied. She became an actress, earning critical acclaim for her work in films and television, building a career entirely on her own terms. But the Presley legacy was always there in the background, enormous and inescapable. When Lisa Marie Presley died in January of 2023 at the age of 54, following a cardiac arrest, the Presley estate, including Graceland itself, passed to Riley. She was 33 years old at the time. The transition was not without legal turbulence. Priscilla Presley, Elvis's ex-wife and Lisa Marie's mother, briefly contested a trust amendment that had been made in 2016, questioning whether Riley and her late twin brother Benjamin should have been named the primary trustees. The matter was eventually settled privately, and Riley emerged as the clear and recognized owner of Graceland and steward of the Presley legacy. IT was responsibility she accepted with visible seriousness. Rather than immediately commercializing the estate or opening it up to entertainment deals, Riley took a more measured approach. She engaged with archivists. She met with preservation specialists. She consulted with historians and cultural scholars about the best way to honor her grandfather's memory without reducing it to something cheap or exploitative. And slowly, carefully, she began to speak, not to generate headlines, but to share a truth she felt the world deserved to hear. What she revealed about the upstairs of Graceland has changed the way many people understand Elvis Presley. Not the king of rock and roll, not the jumpsuit-wearing Las Vegas performer, not the myth, the man. The second floor of Graceland contains several rooms, but it is the private spaces, the bedroom, the study, a small meditation room, and the bathroom where Elvis died, that Riley has spoken about most carefully and most tenderly. These are not rooms designed for display. They were never intended to be seen by anyone outside the family. And that, Riley has said, is precisely what makes them so honest that Elvis's bedroom remains exactly as he left it. The bed is made with the same silk sheets that were on it the morning of August 16th. On one of the two nightstands beside the bed sits a well-worn Bible, its margins filled with handwritten notes, underlinings, annotations, questions Elvis had scrawled in his own hand during years of private reading. He was deeply interested in spirituality, particularly in the later years of his life, and his religious curiosity ranged far beyond traditional Christianity. He read extensively on numerology, on Eastern philosophy, on theosophy, and the writings of various mystical traditions. This was not a public side of Elvis. It was a private search conducted largely in isolation, upstairs in the rooms no one else was allowed to enter. On the other nightstand, according to Riley, there were prescription medication bottles. Some of them still had pills inside. This detail is painful but important. It speaks to the reality of Elvis's final years, a man who was physically suffering, dependent on medications that his doctor prescribed in alarming quantities, trapped in a cycle that the people around him either couldn't or wouldn't break. The medication bottles sitting on that nightstand, undisturbed for nearly 5 decades, are not a monument to scandal. They are a monument to a human being who was struggling in ways the public never fully understood. Beneath the bed, Riley discovered something that stopped her completely. A plain shoebox. On the lid, written in permanent marker and handwriting she recognized as her grandfather's, were 2 words: "Do not open." She opened it. Inside were letters, unsent letters. Several of them. One was addressed to Lisa Marie, Elvis's daughter, Riley's mother. Another bore no specific name, only the instruction: "To whoever finds this after I'm gone." Riley has not shared the contents of those letters publicly, and she has been clear that she may never do so. But she has acknowledged that reading them reshaped her understanding of who her grandfather was. A man who had things he desperately wanted to say, but couldn't bring himself to send. The letters, she has said, were not angry. They were not scandalous. They were heartbreaking in the quietest way possible, full of love and confusion, and the loneliness of a person who had everything the world considers valuable and still felt profoundly lost. Adjacent to the bedroom is Elvis's personal study, a room that has never been part of the official Graceland tour and about which very little has ever been written. Riley describes it as a dark, wood-paneled space with bookshelves floor to ceiling. The books themselves tell a story. Titles on Christian theology sit alongside texts on Eastern mysticism. There are volumes on numerology and metaphysics, books about the nature of consciousness and the mystery of the human soul. Elvis was not a casual reader. He was a searching one, a person using books the way some people use prayer. Among the bookshelves, there are notebooks, Elvis's own notebooks, filled in his own hand. Riley has described these as deeply personal documents, part journal, part spiritual diary, part creative sketchpad. Some entries read, she says, like prayers addressed to no one in particular. Others are more erratic, half-finished song lyrics that trail off midline, long rambling paragraphs that spiral into fragments, quotes from books he was reading copied out and then annotated with his own thoughts. One page, she has mentioned, bore a single word written repeatedly across the entire surface of the paper. The word free, followed by a question marked, "IT is a haunting image." The most famous man in the world, alone in a locked room, asking himself whether freedom was even a real thing he could ever hope to have. Also within the upstairs hallway is a small room that Riley refers to as a quiet room, a space that appears in no official Graceland documentation, no tour guide description, no authorized biography of Elvis Presley. This room, she says, was designed by Elvis himself as a space for meditation and reflection. It is modest in size, with low lighting and cushions arranged on the floor. An old sound machine, the kind that produces white noise or the sound of rain, sits in the corner. Elvis, according to Riley, retreated to this room regularly in the final years of his life. He would go there to pray, to think, to sit in silence. It was the one place in the house, she suggests, where he could be completely still. The existence of this room says something important about who Elvis was beneath the performance. Here was a man who wore capes and rhinestones on stage, who performed to audiences of tens of thousands, who was mobbed wherever he went, and who built himself a tiny, carpeted room with no windows where he could sit alone on the floor and listen to the sound of rain. The contrast is almost too large to take in at once. There's one room on the second floor of Graceland that Riley Keough will not describe in detail. The bathroom where Elvis Presley died remains, in her words, entirely intact and entirely private. She confirms that it has not been altered. The towels have not been replaced. The fixtures have not been updated. It is sealed, she says, with the same reverence one might reserve for a sacred space. This is a complicated thing to consider. The bathroom where Elvis died has been the subject of morbid fascination for decades, discussed in tabloids, referenced in biographies, recreated in dramatizations. The public has a strange and persistent appetite for the details of that room, as though understanding the physical space might somehow explain the tragedy. But Riley has drawn a clear line. That room is not a historical exhibit. It is not available for analysis or documentation. It belongs to the family, and the family has chosen to keep it closed. What she has said about the bathroom is this. In the years before his death, Elvis used it as a refuge. He would spend long hours there, alone, reading or meditating. It was one of the few places in the house where he could lock the door and be completely by himself. The tragedy of where he died is inseparable, in Riley's telling, from the fact that he was alone at the moment it happened, as he so often was, despite being surrounded by dozens of people at all times. The upstairs of Graceland, in Riley's portrait of it, is fundamentally a story about loneliness. It is a hidden underside of an extraordinary public life, the private space where a man who gave everything to everyone else came to be quietly, desperately alone. Among the most persistent questions surrounding the sealed upstairs rooms is whether Elvis left behind music that has never been heard. This is not an idle fantasy. It is grounded in documented fact. Elvis continued to record privately in the years before his death, particularly in the Jungle Room studio on the ground floor of Graceland, where his final professional sessions took place in 1976. Producers and session musicians who worked with him during that period have consistently said that not everything recorded during those sessions was officially released. Some material was left incomplete. Some was shelved because Elvis's declining health made finishing the tracks impossible. Beyond the formal sessions, Elvis was known to record himself informally and regularly. He would sing into portable recorders, work through ideas at the piano late at night, and make rough recordings that he shared with close collaborators or simply kept for himself. His longtime producer Felton Jarvis spoke openly about what he called late-night tapes, personal recordings that Elvis made not for commercial release, but for his own private purposes. Whether any of those tapes survive, and where they might be stored, has never been definitively answered. Riley Keough, in speaking about the upstairs study and bedroom, has described personal artifacts that have not been cataloged, documents, handwritten materials, and what she refers to generally as recordings. She has not specified what those recordings contain, but archivists who have been given limited access to Graceland storage have indicated that there are materials in the private areas of the estate, particularly in the study and bedroom spaces, that have not yet been fully processed or digitized. This is not confirmation of a lost album hiding beneath Elvis's bed, but it is confirmation that the complete inventory of what Elvis left behind has not been made public, and may not be for some time. Riley has spoken about ongoing digitization efforts, using high-resolution scanning and modern archival techniques to preserve handwritten lyrics, personal correspondence, and other materials. This process, she has indicated, is being conducted carefully and slowly, with an emphasis on preservation rather than commercial release. Whether any of this material will eventually reach the public, and in what form, remains an open question. Riley has been clear that she is not interested in releasing things simply because they exist. The decision about what to share, she has said, will be guided by what best honors the person her grandfather actually was, rather than by what generates the most commercial interest. There is something deeply unusual about the position Riley Keough occupies. She is, by any measure, a young woman in her mid-30s who has inherited one of the most complex cultural legacies in American history. She is not simply managing a famous person's estate. She is a custodian of a symbol. Elvis Presley is not just a musician to the millions of people who love him. He is a representation of an entire era of post-war American optimism, of the birth of rock and roll, of a specific kind of Southern charisma and working-class aspiration made magnificent and then made tragic. Managing that legacy means making decisions that are never simply financial or legal. Every choice Riley makes about Graceland sends a message about how Elvis should be understood. Opening a new exhibit says something. Denying a film crew access says something. Speaking about the upstairs room says something. She is aware of this, and she navigates it with care that her public statements consistently reflect. What she has chosen to communicate, through her disclosures about the second floor, is that Elvis Presley was a human being, complicated, searching, struggling, and deeply loving in ways he could not always express. The shoebox of unsent letters, the notebooks filled with questions, the quiet meditation room no one knew about. These details do not diminish the legend. They complete it. They place the glittering public performance of Elvis Presley's life in its proper context, as a visible surface of a much deeper, much more private interior world. Riley has said that she does not intend to open the upstairs to visitors, and she is unequivocal about that. Some things, she has said, are meant to stay personal, but personal does not mean secret forever. It means held carefully, shared thoughtfully, offered to the world not as spectacle but as truth. She is also working to expand the educational dimension of Graceland's legacy, building partnerships with universities and cultural institutions to ensure that Elvis is studied not simply as a celebrity, but as a historical figure whose influence on music, race relations, popular culture, and American identity deserves serious scholarly attention. This is a significant shift. For much of the past half-century, the discourse around Elvis has oscillated between idolatry and tabloid sensationalism, with very little room in between for genuine historical analysis. Riley is trying to create that room. Her approach to the digital archive is part of the same project. By having Elvis's handwritten materials scanned, cataloged, and prepared for potential academic use, she is treating her grandfather not as a brand to be managed, but as a historical figure whose private writings and thoughts have genuine cultural and scholarly value. It is, in its own way, a form of respect, one that takes a man seriously rather than simply selling the myth. People have been asking questions about the upstairs of Graceland for nearly 50 years. What kept those questions alive was not just a mystery. It was a sense that somewhere behind that locked door, the real Elvis Presley was still present. Not the performer, not the icon, the actual person. Riley Keough's decision to begin sharing what she knows about those rooms is significant precisely because she is not doing it for the reasons one might expect. She is not releasing a documentary. She is not launching a television series. She is not selling access. She is simply speaking, quietly, selectively, and with obvious love for a grandfather she never had the chance to know as an adult, but has come to understand more deeply through the objects and words he left behind. What she has described is not a house frozen in time for theatrical purposes. It is a house frozen in time because a family that loved the man who lived there could not bring themselves to change it. The clock still showing the time of Elvis's death. The Bible with the handwritten notes. The shoebox marked "Do Not Open." The quiet room with the cushions on the floor. These are not museum pieces. They are the remnants of a private life, tender, painful, and achingly human. Elvis Presley gave the world his voice, his charisma, his music, and his image for 20 years. He gave it everything he had, and then some. What he kept for himself, what he locked upstairs and guarded from the world, was his inner life, his doubts and his prayers and his longing for freedom and his unsent letters to the daughter he loved. Riley Keough, standing at the foot of that staircase with all of her grandfather's legacy in her hands, has made a quiet and courageous choice. She has decided that the world deserves to know not just who Elvis was on a stage in Las Vegas, but who he was alone in a small room with a sound machine and a question mark written over and over on a page. That story, the real one, the private one, is finally, gently beginning to be told. Not all at once, not fully, but enough to remind us that the most famous man of his generation was, beneath all of it, just a person searching for peace in a world that never let him be still. And somewhere upstairs at Graceland, in rooms that still smell his cologne and still hold his books and his letters and his unanswered questions, that person is still waiting to be truly understood.